You ready?
Sound my phone too. You get these random calls from Skype. You get these to update your system? Just like in the middle of the night, Skype calls me, it says, urgent message, update your system.
All right, we ready? You ready?
Yep.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Larry Williams, the Director of the Center for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, or CARMA, here at Wayne State University. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, let me extend a special welcome and make sure that you know that CARMA is a nonprofit educational center within the School of Administration and the Department of Psychology at Wayne State University. And our mission is to provide research methods education for organizational and social sciences. One of our main programs that we have is our consortium webcast program, in which we bring in distinguished visitors to give lectures on research methods topics. And we're very excited to have Steve Floyd joining us today. It is Friday, October the 19th, if I didn't say that. Beautiful day in Midtown Detroit, with a special excitement as our Detroit Tigers have made it to the World Series. Steve's here to do a webcast that he'll be delivering at noon, but we always like to take advantage of the presence of distinguished guests and do what we hope is kind of an informal chat to learn more about their careers and different perspectives they have on research methods and management. So, Steve, welcome to Detroit.
Pleasure, Larry. Thanks for having me.
So, I'm always interested in how people get into the fields that they get into. So could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up as a doctoral student at the University of Colorado?
Well, there's kind of the idealized story, and then there's the real story.
Oh, we want the real story.
The real story is I'd gotten an MBA from the University of Colorado in the late 70s and gone into the business world. And I worked in a company, it was a manufacturing company. We made food equipment, so restaurant equipment. And the big growth area at that time in food equipment was fast food. All went very well. We had big customers like McDonald's, Burger King, Domino's, which actually is not located very far from here in Ann Arbor. But then along came the last Great Recession. The big recession we're having now was preceded by a recession in 1980-81. And those of you who are young enough not to remember this may be astounded by the fact that prime rate, for example, interest rates in the United States were hovering around 18%. And in the franchised fast food world, most of the financing is individuals financing through their mortgages and so on. So with mortgages at that interest rate, none of the formulas worked. Fast food business collapsed. My business collapsed. And I got very disenchanted with being a business person. I decided I always wanted to be a college professor, which I actually did, but I'd kind of gotten sidetracked. And so then that motivated me to look at PhD programs and got me into the PhD program at the University of Colorado.
Yeah. So what do you remember about your statistics and methods training as a graduate student?
That too kind of has an idealized version of the true story. I got an A in my stats course, my first stats course, taught by Don Plain. I don't know whether you know Don Plain. He's written a couple of stats books. But I got the A by a sort of a strange route. I almost failed every quiz up until the final exam. I would get C's, D's, occasional F's on the weekly quizzes because I was basically a lazy graduate student in my first couple of years. But on the final exam, somehow, some way, I sat with the book over a period of about a week, and it all sort of clicked.
Yeah.
Basic ideas like theory of samples and so on. So I got an A plus, 100% on my exam. And Don Plain said to me, Steve, it was a cumulative exam. You demonstrated you know the material, so I'm going to give you an A for the course.
Ah.
So I was quite pleased about that.
Yeah, yeah. So were there particular challenges in your statistics and your methods training? Things that you found difficult about it, or
There were a lot of specific challenges in my methods training. It's hard to identify one in particular. I guess the one that gave me the most struggle is the relationship between ANOVA and regression. I mean, I understand it now, I think, sort of at a basic level, but they seem to me at the time to be much different approaches to problems. When in fact they're completely harmonized in terms of their approaches.
Yeah.
The one is sort of categorical and one is more experimental and the other is more, what I saw at that time, more field-based and more continuous variables and so on, and sort of put it into my head these are actually doing the same thing in different ways. It was a real challenge.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was a grad student in the early 80s in psychology, and there were separate courses. I had a regression course that I actually had to go to sociology to get, but an analysis of variance course in the psychology department. Whereas I think nowadays most of the graduate programs, like here at Wayne State, you know, teach this general linear model that make it a lot easier to see that connection. But I can appreciate...
we didn't have the general linear model on our syllabus in those days.
Yeah, well, that was when we had cards, stacks of card text to run our SPSS analysis. So now you're out and you've been involved in different types of empirical research over the years. I'd wonder if you just kind of comment on the different types of methods and analyses that characterize your substantive research.
Well, I did my dissertation using SEM, actually. I used Literal, probably about Literal 6 or something. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Mid-1980s. So I feel like that was really excellent, actually, to understand the general linear model and understand measurement and structural relationships kind of holistically. It was really very, very helpful to me. I did it under an IO Psych chair. That's who sort of pushed me in that direction. So that sort of raised my awareness about the power of analytical frameworks to shape what you're trying to accomplish in the research design. I didn't stick with it primarily because in strategy at that time, and I think even to this day, we were a little behind in terms of our analytical methods compared to, say, OB. And so if you tried to publish a paper using SEM in the mid-1980s in Strategic Management Journal, it would come back to you and say, well, what is this? Reviewers really wouldn't have understood what you're trying to do. So that got me back to regression as the primary tool. It's also very consistent with, depending on how you approach it, with field research and survey methods as an approach to gathering data, because you can do the development of the measures and the testing of the relationships in a kind of a straightforward way, which is easy to understand, fairly transparent. So most of my quantitative research has been some kind of multiple regression, multivariate regression, as far as I can remember, in strategy, with some ANOVA and some other stuff thrown in to deal with specific sets of conditions.
Yeah.
Recently, primarily because I've been in Europe for a period of time and began to meet European colleagues around 2001, 2002, and then spent 4 years working in Switzerland, and with a lot of friends in the United Kingdom, where in both continental Europe and the United Kingdom, there's a lot of emphasis, as you know, on qualitative research. So I've been motivated to try to learn what it means to do rigorous qualitative research. And in my view, there's a lot of opportunity to develop standards for qualitative research, which still are a bit murky depending on the kind of qualitative research you're trying to do. So I've taken an interest in trying to accomplish, to write a journal article for a premier journal, to write a paper on using qualitative methods is a challenge which I've tried to take up with co-authors to try to learn how to do that. So I think it's
So why is there that reaction, do you think, to qualitative methods within strategy?
Well, I think it's mainly for lack of consensus about what constitutes, for example, appropriate data analysis. Last night I was reviewing a great paper submitted to the SNJ, qualitative paper, really a wonderful, I won't discuss the content of the paper and mention otherwise anything about it, except that it left out analysis entirely. So it talked about how it collected the data, talked about where the data came from, the interviews and so on. So the data collection was totally, well, not totally transparent, but pretty well articulated. But going from that to the inferences is a total black box. And so the analytical process that a person uses to go from qualitative data to some kind of generally theory-building kind of propositions as opposed to any hypothesis testing is not well settled, I don't think. there are a number of different approaches to content analysis, axial coding, grounded theory, and so on. But there's not a lot of agreement, and where there is agreement, it tends to be spotty. So trying to find reviewers, for example, who know the strategy, the content of the theory, and also the qualitative methods standards is problematic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as an SEM person who's written some on SEM and strategy, I think the real challenge, as contrasted with like the micro OB, is the challenge of finding multiple indicators.
Yeah.
In a lot of OB research, your 4 indicators of a given latent variable can be 4 items from an existing scale, or maybe even you create parcels, and those will all be very highly correlated, which helps meet the requirements of what you need to do latent variable analysis. But with the type of objective measures that characterize the field of strategy, getting multiple operationalizations of the same thing may not be easy, and then finding them to be highly correlated enough to meet those needs is even more of a challenge. So,
particularly given the nature of our variables.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a study done by Don Hamrick and a colleague on CEO narcissism. So how do you get at something like a psychological construct among CEOs? They're not going to fill out a rigorous psychological instrument. So they use these very clever, unobtrusive measures, such as look at the annual shareholders report, the letter to shareholders in the annual report. How many times is the word I used versus we? How many times does the CEO's picture appear in the annual report? And these are things that may be sort of loosely correlated, but not correlated to the extent that they would pass muster as a measure of reliability in the SEM sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, with that kind of diverse methods and analyses, are there any particular references or books now that you find that you rely on as kind of what you need to go to when you have any type of method question or stat question?
I usually go, actually, what I do when I confront a methods or stat question, I have my favorites sort of text, but I try to go back to the journal that I'm working with to find out, to see the latest article published using that particular technique.
Yeah.
Because there's this variation. AMJ would have a different sort of set of standards and expectations than SMJ even.
Yeah.
Although not widely different, but somewhat different. So that's what I generally do to educate myself. And then if I don't understand something like that, I go to Pedersen or some other sort of fundamental text, one of your texts, to try to understand what's going on. But usually it's because I have this, I feel like I have kind of a broad understanding. What I don't have necessarily specific understanding about a particular use of a method in a particular setting, so that really requires looking at the journals.
Yeah.
I find ORM very useful in that, for doing my own research actually, as well as for...
Well, one issue is that the techniques, in many areas, the developments occur and there's a lot of changes, so to get to the latest, you do have to go to a journal like Organizational Research Methods. And I think your advice to go to an outlet that you're considering using is great advice, because even for a given analytical technique, it seems like there are differences across outlets in what the norms are for the types of information that should be included and how it should be reported. So you mentioned looking at a paper in your role as associate editor for SMJ. I would wonder if you could just talk about, in general, kind of what the methods or analysis shortcomings are that are most common in the papers that you get the chance to review.
That's an interesting question. I think one of the hot buttons that's developed in strategy in the last, I don't know, my impression is the last 2 or 3 years, is the challenge of endogeneity, which is basically rampant in everything we do. That's a given. So everything is related to everything else at some level. So if you have a multivariate equation of some kind, there's going to be endogeneity. So how do you handle that? And I think that the question of how you handle it is the challenge. And again, there are different ways to approach it, and but not a lot of consensus about what the best way is. So again, I have my orientation to that. I've been through that myself as an author and tried to make sense of the best kinds of approaches. You know, instrumental variable approach seems to me to be sort of the gold standard for trying to deal with that. But very often, instrumental variable is not obvious, and the proposed instrumental variable may not be. You know, the author may choose a convenience variable that obviously has to be one that they've actually measured. So you make a compromise for what the ideal would be versus what you've actually gotten. And then the question is, what does that really mean? So you picked an instrumental variable out of the set of things you measured, didn't anticipate this, but now you're using it as an instrumental variable. So it seems to me to compromise the whole issue of testing for indigeneity.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how a lot of times we realize that we may be violating an assumption that's required of a particular technique, so we come up with an alternative that we think will work, but we're too quick to forget that that alternative technique, you know, has its own set of assumptions that may be more difficult to meet than the assumption of the original technique that we were trying to solve the problems with.
Right.
You know, we're very thankful to have had experience from editors of a variety of types of journals coming to CARMA, and I'm always interested in part because of my own experiences, as to how you think that being an editor has shaped your own approach to research, and how you might do research differently as a result of your editorial experience. Not just at SMJ, but you were editors in other journals as well. So how do you approach things differently now, given that you've sat on that side of the desk, to use the phrase?
Well, I think it raises awareness. When you see a lot of papers over and over again, you see, you know, literally hundreds of reviews a year. You see some common themes that keep coming back, which maybe you're aware of as an author, but you don't really focus on as much because they seem more like stylistic concerns than actual substance. For example, the motivation for a paper. So motivating a paper, trying to articulate what is wrong with current explanations of this phenomenon, the theory, and what part of the current explanation is flawed, and therefore why you're addressing that in this particular paper. Going through that logic is extremely important. I mean, if you don't motivate a paper, there's no reason to read any further, you know, obviously. But it's one of the most often neglected, in terms of major flaws, one of the most often neglected features of paper. So that's raised my awareness about trying to overcome that in my own research. And on the front end, as opposed to, I mean, very often this is sort of retrospective sense-making about why we did what we did. Trying to think that through at the design stage of a study, I think turns out to be very, very important. So those kinds of things, and what really amount to, well, the other thing that's a sort of a hot button for me is the structural conventions. So what's a paper flow look like in a deductive theory paper? What's it look like in a hypothesis testing paper? Reviewers have very strong expectations. They expect, for example, AMJ to turn to the discussion. The first paragraph should be a summary of the results. The second paragraph should be the main contribution to the studies articulated in the very first paragraph of the paper, in the introduction. The second paragraph is another one of those key papers. Third paragraph, another one of those key papers. So very specific articulation about this study contributes, extends, otherwise contradicts, or whatever, to the existing research. And that kind of, again, convention, if you don't understand it and you write something that's more like a conclusion, for example, in the discussion, because many reviewers, what I see in terms of their write-ups, are the first thing they talk about is the contribution or the motivation, what appears at the end of the paper, as opposed to the analysis or research design or hypotheses. So what it raises, and I've had reviewers tell me that they go through the paper like this, they don't read the introduction, they read the discussion section. So if the discussion is not doing what they expected it to do, the paper's lost any kind of credibility in the reviewer's eyes. So that structural conventions have really kind of come to the fore in my mind as something to try to impart, particularly to PhD students, to understand what those are in a very explicit way. And they did, again, change from journal to journal somewhat, but the top journals, they're fairly consistent about their expectations for what goes where and when it appears in the paper.
Yeah. So given the different expectations that reviewers bring to the examination of any given paper, it's not uncommon that their views of a manuscript differ dramatically.
Yeah.
So could you share kind of, you have a general approach of how you deal with that scenario where you've got different perspectives on the paper?
Yeah. That differs somewhat by journal. For example, at SMJ, we have what I would call as a strong reviewer model. So something like 80% of the reviewers for SMJ papers are editorial board members.
Mm-hmm.
The use of ad hoc reviewers is rather limited. There's only, as you know, for the most part, there's only 2 reviewers on an SMJ paper, but they're 2 very senior people typically in the field with a lot of expertise relative to the paper, and editorial board members, which means as an editor you have a lot of confidence in what they're saying. You know, they generally write very good reviews. If they disagree, that's a big problem, because you have one-on-one. So there are 2 solutions. One is seek a 3rd review. The problem with that is it extends the paper's processing into 2 or 3 months, which goes against another goal of SMJ, which is to turn around papers within 60 to 90 days. You can't do that if you ask for a 3rd review. The other option is equally onerous, which is for me to get educated about the specific content of this dispute and try to resolve it. And typically that's my first choice, is to see what it will take for me to try to sort out. And with the caveat that this is something that's encouraged by the co-editors of the journal, it's also a bias that I generally have, is to give the benefit of the doubt to the author. So if I do go through this process and I can't resolve it clearly, I would call for a revision and let the author have the benefit of the critical review as well as a more supportive review, and try to sort it out for themselves, and let the author try to manage that dispute.
Do those differences, would you say, typically deal with substantive issues or methodological issues?
Almost always with substantive issues, in my experience. Not to say there aren't methodological concerns, but the big debates are over contribution, for example. With a conceptual paper or a theory-building paper, contribution is inevitably in the eye of the beholder. There's some subjective judgment involved in trying to assess that. But it's amazing to hear one reviewer say this paper is just rehashing old news, and the other reviewer talking about how interesting the paper is. It's like they're living in 2 different literatures.
Yeah.
But I think it has to do with personal perspectives and somewhat attribution biases about what's going on in the field. So yeah, I think it's for the most part over substance. And maybe it doesn't get to the methods part because the substance raises its head first.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, you're here to give a 1-hour lecture on a research methods topic that's offered as part of our consortium webcast program, of which you can find more information on the CARMA website. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about beginning at noon here?
The title of the talk is Rediscovering the Individual in Strategy. And kind of the gist of the talk is to try to look at 3 particular research streams and the challenges they face in trying to link individual behaviors, individual activities, individual leadership styles, and so on, to outcomes such as organizational performance, the strategy of the organization. And it's a bit like, I think of it sort of graphically as an individual. I live on a lake in New England, and occasionally a dog will wander into the lake in February when the lake is frozen, but just barely frozen. So the dog falls into the ice and struggles to get out, obviously. It's trying to get the individual out, the individual effects out of a research study to connect to organizational outcomes. It's kind of like the dog trying to get out of the ice, trying to find their way up. It's a long causal chain. I think we've done too little, I think, to try to address that causal chain. So that's really the thrust of the paper, the thrust of the argument, is to try to think more deliberately about what we can do to make those kind of connections across these 3 different research streams.
Okay. Well, we're going to look forward to it. My last question, one of the things that I always enjoy about the guests that come to share their experiences with us is the diversity of personalities and interest and the things that drive them. And I just was wondering, if you have anything that you do, that you rely on, that provides inspiration or motivation for your work.
Well, I'll just mention the latest thing that's inspiring me is this emphasis. It goes under the label of behavioral strategy. And Daniel Kahneman I'm a big fan of Daniel Kahneman's work, and he's written a recent book called Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking, which exposes this set of ideas around the whole idea of bias and heuristics and psychological considerations when thinking about how people make decisions. Exposes it in a way which is really accessible. So for a non-specialist like me, I'm not a psychologist, I can access the ideas. He actually talks about the experiments he conducts, or he conducted with Amos Tversky and others, to establish the principles of System 1, System 2, dual processing theory, which is articulated in this book really well. So those kinds of sources I find are very, very, a long, deep, rich treatment of a set of ideas. Mm-hmm. Very often I find inspiring.
Yeah. And I'm guessing you may read that while you're on your pontoon boat enjoying the outside.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Well, it's been great having this opportunity to chat with you. And again, Steve is here for the CARMA Consortium webcast lecture that's going to be coming up shortly. So you can get more information about CARMA on our website. Obviously, if you're watching this live, you're catching us on Facebook, and we have previous Meet the Methodologist interviews on CARMA YouTube, our CARMA YouTube channel. So, Alex, thanks for all your work in getting this set up. Steve, pleasure.
Larry.
Yep.
My pleasure.
And enjoy the World Series. Thanks.